For me, I think a voice, and a song in particular, carries with it a human experience at its simplest, and often its rawest. And music has always been a vehicle for the spirit of people, the spirit of the times, and the stories of people. And where we believe those stories, that's empathy in action. And that's where action can begin.
And I could cry.
Hi, I'm Hozier, and this is Cry Power, my podcast about people who are using what's available to them to change the world. Presented with our friends at Global Citizen, on each episode I'll be sitting down with people who are putting themselves out there to support a cause that's dear to them. I'll be talking to people whose work is making a real difference, musicians, artists, or just some of my heroes. Hello and welcome to another Cry Power. This is Andrew Hozier Byrne here. Today on the show we have the man who set up the movement with whom we have created this very podcast. He is the founder and chief executive of Global Citizen, Hugh Evans. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us time out of your incredibly busy schedule.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of your podcast, and thank you for taking the initiative. I think it's absolutely wonderful. All the amazing episodes that you've produced are just incredible and so inspiring.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You were saying you were bouncing from Mexico through Canada. You've joined us here today. You've only landed a little while ago, I think. So,
that's right. Yeah, just got back, but happy to be home.
No, it's great. It's great. Do you mind if I'll take us back? I know that the Global Poverty Project was set up in 2008, I believe. And Global Citizen itself was founded in 2012. Can you talk to us about how it came to be and how it all started?
Yeah, so for me, it's been a lifelong journey. It started when I was 12 years old. I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and I remember really vividly one day, I think it was like my first few weeks of high school, a lady from an aid organization called World Vision came and spoke at our school about raising money for kids in the developing world. And you're very impressionable when you're that age. Well, I was very impressionable. And, I put up my hand and I said, okay, I'm going to try to fundraise as much as I can. And our school became the highest fundraising school in the country. Amazing. And so I won a competition to go to the Philippines to see their work firsthand. Mm-hmm. And there was a night in the Philippines that changed my life forever, where we were taken onto a slum in the center of Manila called Smoky Mountain. It's a community that's built on top of a rubbish dump, where the whole infrastructure of the community revolves around scavenging. So the kids run after the garbage trucks every day and try to get bits of scrap metal, piece of food, and things that they can recycle. And I was placed in the care that night of a guy my own age. We were both 14 at the time. His name is Sonny Boy. Mm-hmm. And, where I'd grown up in middle-class Melbourne in Australia, he had tattoos on his forearm at the age of 14 because he was about to become his gang leader, and that was his form of initiation.
Right.
And that night he took me to his house and we cooked this meal together with some food that I brought with me. And when it came time to go to sleep, we just lay down, myself, Sonny Boy, and the rest of his family, 7 of us, in this long line. And I'll never, ever forget lying there that night with just lying on the concrete slab with cockroaches crawling all around us and the smell of rubbish because we're lying on top of a garbage dump. Yeah. And I didn't sleep at all. I just lay awake thinking to myself, it really is pure chance that I was born where I was born and he was born where he was born. Mm-hmm. It's, as Warren Buffett likes to call it, the lottery of life. Mm-hmm. And so I decided that night I wanted to commit my life to this, but I didn't really know what that meant. Mm-hmm. And so I came back and I saw what Mother Teresa was doing in India, and I said to my mum, I want to go and work with Mother Teresa. And I remember, I know it sounds silly in hindsight, but Mum said to me, there's no way I'm going to let you go to India. And so I made a deal with her. I said, if I can get a full scholarship so you don't have to pay for it and it's all covered, would you let me go by myself? And she said yes. And so I applied for a scholarship. And I got this scholarship to go and study at a school in the Himalayan mountains, a small school called Woodstock School in Uttarakhand in northern India. And I remember trudging off to the airport, like after I'd got the scholarship and was about to say goodbye to my friends and family. I went through customs immigration. I sat on the airplane next to this complete stranger. He was this big businessman. And I remember I looked him up in the eyes and I just burst into tears. I was so scared. Mm-hmm. Like it all of a sudden dawned on me what was coming. And that year, totally turned my life upside down. I think I went to India very much as a self-conscious 15-year-old kid.
You're only 15.
Yeah.
And you went, this was a year in India on your own.
Yeah.
Okay.
At a school, but yeah. And I came back with the realization that, 2/3 of the world don't live, as I lived in Australia, that 2/3 of the planet in those days lived in extreme poverty. And in those days, 700 million people in India alone were homeless or slum dwellers, which is 39 times our population of Australia. And so I was both moved but incredibly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all. Fast forward several years, I was studying law in Melbourne, and I'd just come back from a year and a half living at an orphanage for children orphaned by HIV/AIDS in South Africa. And me and my mate Dan, we were both studying at the same university. We had this idea to run this small concert called the Make Poverty History Concert because we're inspired by what had happened with Live 8. And this is 2006 when the G20 was coming through Melbourne. And our small concert one day exploded when I got a phone call from Bono and Pearl Jam who said they wanted to headline our show. Nice. And I thought it was a prank call at the time. I was like, yeah, right. That's really cool. Yeah, come on. And sure enough, they came on first and sang Rockin' in the Free World by Neil Young. And that day, 1 million Australians got involved in our campaign and got the Make Poverty History white armband.
Yeah.
And we managed to convince the government to come on stage and make an announcement to double foreign aid. And so we secured $6.2 billion in new investments for the eradication of extreme poverty. And off the back of that, I got a phone call from the United Nations here in New York who said that they wanted to help us take our work all around the world.
Yes, okay.
And in those days, I didn't really know what that meant because we were just getting started.
Yeah. And how did you, you were a law student. You were a law student at the time when you organized that first concert.
That's right.
Just as a law student going about organizing a music festival like that, it's a huge initiative to take, I suppose.
In hindsight, it was hard juggling a law degree at the same time.
No doubt.
But I think when you're passionate about something, you find time. I'm sure you're the perfect example of that with your career. You've just
Thankfully, I'm not juggling a law degree now, I have to say. But incredible. And the Make Poverty History campaign, it was huge. Huge success. Made waves. Of course, across the world. And so after the concert, Bono and Pearl Jam play "Rockin' in the Free World." The announcement is made, foreign aid is doubled. And that, I suppose, is that what led you to the Global Citizen Festival event that took place here in New York?
Well, what happened first was one of my dear friends, Simon, who's our co-founder of Global Citizen, we were just at the cinema in Melbourne, and we went to see An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. And I walked out of that, and I was not only inspired by the clarity of his message, but I was so inspired by the way he was able to communicate a complex topic of tackling climate change and carbon abatement and, how do we put a price on carbon and what does that mean for sustainability more broadly, and do it so succinctly. And so I said to Simon at the time, I said, okay, why don't we try to do for global poverty what Al Gore has done for climate change? And at that stage, I got a scholarship to go to Cambridge in the UK, and the UN gave us a small grant to open an office in London. So Simon and his now wife, Rachel, moved to London. And every weekend I would commute down from Cambridge to London, and we were setting up this small office in London. And from London is where we really birthed, at that stage it was called the Global Poverty Project. And it was around that time that we started our first big campaign, initially on polio eradication, because there's a strong link between polio and extreme poverty. Because global health is one of the key indicators of extreme poverty. If you think about extreme poverty, the building blocks for the eradication of poverty are health, education, water and sanitation, food security, gender equality, the empowerment of girls and women. And these building blocks are ultimately what enable people to lift themselves out of poverty. And we saw that polio was 99% eradicated. It was only endemic in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and northern Nigeria and India in those days. And if we could demonstrate to the world that this is a disease that you could actually get rid of, then you could demonstrate that there are actually progress that could be made on malaria or on HIV/AIDS, on so many other communicable diseases. And so we had this idea to kick off this campaign around the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. So we asked the Queen of England if she would allow us to focus the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting on polio. And she said, well, it was through her private secretary, Christopher Geist at the time. She said, well, you have to ask the host country, which in that case was Australia. And so we asked Julia Gillard, who'd just become the Prime Minister of Australia. And she said, well, polio, it's a bit of an obscure topic,
Yes.
and she said, you have to demonstrate that there's young people who actually care about it. Mm-hmm. So we started rallying everyone we could. Yeah. We convinced John Legend to come to Perth, Australia. He flew over. Thank goodness, he's so generous. And he flew over, and 30,000 young people came to this End of Polio campaign event. And that day we got 5 heads of government. We got David Cameron of Britain, Giuliani of Pakistan, Goodluck Jonathan of Nigeria, Stephen Harper of Canada, and Gillard of Australia to stand on stage and commit $118 million for polio eradication.
Amazing. Okay.
And then Bill Gates agreed to match it.
Okay.
And
okay.
And that's really kind of the genesis, if you will, of Global Citizen, because just after that, my now wife, Taniela, and I moved to New York, and we started with this big dream. Like, we were literally working out of a shoe closet, a broom closet on Lafayette Street, and like no money, and just like a true startup.
Yeah.
And we had this huge dream to see, in the same way that Simon and Garfunkel had, created this commanding presence on the Great Lawn of Central Park back in the day. Mm-hmm. Could there be a concert that united humanity for the end of extreme poverty during the UN General Assembly meeting? But could we do it with a twist where you couldn't buy a ticket, you'd have to earn your way in through your social actions? And that's how Global Citizen started. And honestly, the first few years were a little crazy.
Right. And so that was between 2008 2012. 2012,
right.
I understand, was the first was the
first year. Yeah.
How did you mobilize artists to take part in that?
That year and the first 2 years, honestly, were a bit crazy because like pulling off this event for free on the Great Lawn meant that we had to raise all the money because you couldn't sell tickets, right?
Yeah.
And it's not cheap on the Great Lawn of Central Park.
I can't imagine.
So firstly, I was introduced by a gentleman by the name of Rick Mueller. He introduced me to John Silver, who manages the Foo Fighters. And John said, he said, the Great Lawn of Central Park, he said in those days, is the holy grail. He said, if you can get the Great Lawn, then all of my artists will perform for free. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'm like, okay, that's a good challenge. And so I reached out to Mayor Bloomberg's office, and I said to Mayor Bloomberg's team, I know you haven't granted a Saturday on the Great Lawn since like Bon Jovi and Simon and Garfunkel, but would you do it in this instance? Because we're going to give away the tickets for free. It's going to drive social action towards the. In those days, it was still the Millennium Development Goals before the Sustainable Development Goals were launched. And we wanted to see if we could actually halve extreme poverty by 2015. And fortunately, Mayor Bloomberg granted us permission. And I went back to John Silver, and this is the funny thing. He's like, "Oh no, like he's my ex." He actually said, he's
bluff gold,
really cheeky. He's like, "Okay, the Foo Fighters will still perform, but you need to get a headliner." Because he said it's 60,000 people on the Great Lawn. That's too big. Yeah. And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it!" And like, so I'm not kidding. This is what literally happened. We were a month and a half out from the festival. We were already in August, and we were still $1.5 million short of pulling it off.
Okay.
And with no headliner.
Okay.
And so we thought, okay, this is not going to happen. Like all these really generous people, like Larry King hosted a fundraiser for us in LA and a couple of people here. But like, we were just making like not enough progress. And I just thought, okay, that idea, you've probably heard this, like, if you can make it in America, you can make it. So in my back of my mind, I kept thinking to myself, I'm going to fail so miserably. I'm going to, like, before it even gets started, it's not even going to get going. Yeah. And this is why I do believe in miracles, because literally one day I was in LA and I got a phone call from Sumner Redstone's house, and Sumner said, come meet me. And I went over to his house in LA, I sat down with him and shared with him the vision of what we had to do. And literally on the spot, he wrote a check for $1.5 million.
Wow.
And then literally half an hour later, I got a call from Elliot Roberts, who said, Neil Young's on the phone from Hawaii. He wants to speak to you.
Stop.
And I'm not kidding. I drove literally the other side of LA. He was on the phone from Hawaii. He said, I hear about what you think trying to do in Central Park. I'm going to headline. And I'm like, wow. And so
In the one day?
One day,
Wow.
same day.
Wow.
It was unbelievable.
Wow. Okay.
And so that was year one. And we were so exhausted at the end of it that we'd never thought it was going to happen again. But the day after year one, I got a phone call from Rob Light, who said he just spoke to Stevie Wonder, and he said, Stevie Wonder's going to headline year two. And I said, Rob, there is no year two. And he said, there is now. And so that's really how it happened.
Amazing. Okay.
And then from there, the momentum started to really build. And it very much picked up at a huge rate where millions of citizens were signing on to become global citizens, and we started to think of ourselves not as a music festival, but as an advocacy platform where citizens could take action, and those actions would earn them points, and those points would enable them to come to the festival for free. But all of their actions would target world leaders, and those world leaders would be forced to respond yay or nay.
Yes, of course.
Very binary. And that's really become the power of the movement. Now, some 8 years later, $46 billion has been announced on global citizen stages around the world, and it's gone all around the world now. And the organization itself is just, like, sometimes I just have to stop and just, it is...
It's incredible, yeah. It really is for its first year. Just an unthinkably ambitious, event, an unthinkably sort of ambitious, and also quite a radical one in saying, well, how are you going to get people in here? Well, we're not going to charge for people ticket prices. So this is all out of the goodness of people's hearts and their will to do something meaningful.
That's right.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. The goodness of people's hearts is the right phrase, because I think that everything that has happened since is based on the goodness of people's hearts.
Mm-hmm. Which is, again, it's radical. Yeah. It's quite radical, It's amazing. And by 2015, I believe, you had 193 world leaders lining up to agree towards the global sustainability goals. Is that?
Yeah, so what happened was a lady by the name of Amina Mohammed, who was at one point the Environment Minister of Nigeria, but she was also appointed by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to orchestrate a plan called the Sustainable Development Goals. And she asked Global Citizen if the Sustainable Development Goals could be launched on our stage in Central Park. And so what happened was, that was the year that Beyonce and Pearl Jam and Coldplay and Ed Sheeran headlined. And, everyone from Bono through to Richard Branson, through to Malala, through to Michelle Obama, through to Mark Zuckerberg, through to Vice President Joe Biden, through to the Secretary General himself, through to the Deputy Secretary General. Everyone came on stage that year to announce this incredible proclamation that the world truly could, if we can create enough political will, see an end to extreme poverty, tackle climate change, and reduce inequality by 2030. And so that was all announced on our stage in Central Park. And that same year, Chris Martin of Coldplay called up and said he wanted to help us take the festival to a new market every year for the next 15 years.
Okay, wow.
And that was a really generous offer, because up until that point we were in New York, and he's like, okay, we're going to take this together all around the world. And the first year, it was crazy. We decided to take it to India. Yeah. With the support of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We were focused on a big campaign called the Clean India campaign, which is it's called Swachh Bharat, but it's focused on ending open defecation, ensuring that plastics are abated, really focusing on the cleanliness of India.
Sanitary conditions,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so we launched this enormous campaign, and Coldplay and Jay-Z agreed to headline. It was the first time Coldplay had ever performed in India. And what was meant to be a show with 60,000 people ended up being closer to 150, 200,000 people in Mumbai. But what was extraordinary was just that millions of citizens across India started taking action in support of Clean India. People were literally going up to the beaches of Mumbai and picking up plastic and earning points for all the trash that they collected. And it created this incredible groundswell that gave us a new model of taking citizen action both at a grassroots level and at a systemic level at once. So we could drive both direct action and policy action through the platform, and that was really cool.
It's amazing, yeah. The Cry Power podcast will explore the UN's 17 global goals, a series of objectives that aims to end extreme poverty, reduce inequality, and tackle climate change by 2030. To take action on any of these issues we talk about on the show, go to globalcitizen.org/crypower and get involved. There's the 3 categories of the 17 goals, which are human capital, gender equality, and I believe environmental sustainability.
Exactly.
How were those landed upon? I suppose the 17, or how do you prioritize what's most important?
Well, the way that we look at it is the world agreed upon a plan called the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals with 169 indicators. But if you boil all those goals down, they really boil down to 3 big things: ending poverty, tackling climate change, and reducing inequality. And so if you think about each of those buckets for a second, and how do those buckets play into one another? The first bucket of human capital, which is focused on the eradication of poverty, is really the health, education, food security, water, sanitation bucket, because they are really what you would say in economic terms create the enabling environment for people to lift themselves out of poverty. Because the way in which someone in the long term is able to lift themselves out of poverty is they need a good job. But you can't have a good job if you're hungry and you're unhealthy and you're uneducated and you're, in extreme poverty. It's impossible to maintain a job, because if you contract malaria, then you're going to be out of your job for months, for example. And so really those basic building blocks of the eradication of poverty are the human capital bucket. But people often think of climate change as a completely separate issue, but it's not. Because as the poor graduate out of poverty, they inevitably consume more. And we in the West have been consuming more our entire lives.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
And so we often think of climate change as just something that's a Western issue, whereas actually I like to think of it as something that's going to be the biggest challenge for emerging markets: Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, Nigeria. We have to twist the way we think about abating climate change. And it's not just about, alternative, sustainable, renewable energy. It's not just about being more conscious about what we eat and what we consume, but it's actually also about how do we make sure that the roughly billion people on this planet who still live in extreme poverty, who want the same economic opportunities that you and I take for granted, how do we make sure that they can be both brought into the economic system, but at the same time do so in a sustainable fashion for everyone? And often the counterintuitive part of all this, and I don't want to geek out too much, is that it comes down to things like intellectual property.
Okay.
Because when nations become rich, they inevitably create patents, they create IP law that protect the inventions that have enabled them to grow rich.
Yes, yeah.
Whether that's in pharmaceuticals, whether that's in technology, energy, etc. Now, the poor nations, they have a choice. They can say, okay, we're going to take the industrial route, which was the route that was taken by the West, or, as the West is trying to tell us, they want our forests to be the lungs of humanity. But how can we maintain our forests be the lungs of humanity while we're taking industrial route? It's impossible. The only way you can leapfrog is through technology. But while we don't own the patents to those technology, unless they're granted to the poor as a subsidy.
By wealthy nations, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Unless there's some mechanism by which people can participate in the modern economy
Yes.
and leapfrog,
Yeah.
then ultimately, they're forced to take the industrial route.
Yes, yes.
In the West, we can't take a holier-than-thou approach to tackling climate change. We have to do so in a very humble way and realize that 1 billion people want the same opportunities you and I take for granted. How do we create a society where people can all cross that threshold in an inclusive fashion in a way that ultimately is sustainable?
Yes, yeah.
And the reason why the third bucket of gender equality is so important is that gender equality really is a cross-cutting issue across everything. Women are more likely to be denied access to quality education. They also often drop out of school due to access to menstrual hygiene products. They're often not given the same economic opportunities as men. And also, even the very fact that women have to spend hours and hours collecting water every single day in remote parts of this world is both a connection between environmental sustainability and human development. And so we see gender equality as the cross-cutting issue across both big buckets, and development and climate change really being two sides of the same coin.
Totally. And that collaborative thing, sitting down at around the table with world leaders, people who are incredibly powerful, really, I suppose, when collaborating with them and kind of bringing them into the mission and communicating all of this and what the potentials are for ameliorating these issues. How do you go about that, or what does that process look like?
I always start from the mission. Mm-hmm. I think that, and I'm a firm believer that the mission to eradicate extreme poverty is something that unites all of humanity. I think it's above politics. I don't think it's about left or right or centrist. It's about a basic core ideal that I believe is at the heart of everyone, that no person should die for lack of a 30-cent immunization, that no one should suffer needlessly. I really believe that is at the heart of everyone. And so then it becomes a policy question of how do you get there? And most people believe in the consensus that you have to create an environment for people to lift themselves out of poverty. It's not about a handout. It's about the enabling environment for people to do just that. And so, therefore, the building blocks are health, education, water and sanitation, food security, gender equality, and a sustainable environment. And so then you're really having a discussion with a world leader or a private sector leader or a philanthropist about how can they most effectively give towards that outcome. What can they contribute either from a policy framework or from an investment framework to actually achieve that? And so in the case of, say, the world leaders, for example, we really think of it in two buckets. You've got the OECD countries, and there are some who are very generous. They have what I would call the bragging rights, the ability to actually lead by example and show others what they're doing. Then there are these sets of nations that are the mid-range. They're giving around 0.35% of gross national income in foreign aid. And then there are, unfortunately, nations like my own Australia, and I'll tell you the story here, that under the Conservative Prime Minister Tony Abbott slashed foreign aid dramatically. Tony Abbott slashed foreign aid by a whopping $12 billion, which was just devastating. And so you've got nations like my own and others that are unfortunately nowhere near as generous as others. And so we are encouraging those nations to step up. That's the first thing, to give above the median and actually be the most generous nations on this planet. That's the first piece. The second piece is around what can nations that are the poorest nations themselves do, and we call this domestic resource allocation. What percentage of their own GNI do they give towards health, education, water and sanitation investment? And if the poorest 59 countries increased their own domestic resource allocation by just 4%, that alone is going to unlock $70 billion. So huge amounts of capital available through domestic resource allocation. The third big bucket we focus on is the role of the private sector. And the private sector are increasingly economies of themselves. The Fortune 100 and the Fortune 500 companies, they have such enormous procurement power that if they, say, purchase from women-owned businesses, or if they analyze their supply chains to see how environmentally sustainable they are, or if they are willing to look at their labor practices and see how either exploitative or productive they are, then these policy decisions that CEOs and leaders of major corporations can make can have enormous impacts on society. And then the final big bucket we focus on is the role of philanthropists. There are 2,150 billionaires on the planet with a collective net worth of about $10 trillion.
Could you just repeat that figure one last time?
So there are 2,150 billionaires on the planet with a collective net worth of about $10 trillion.
It is remarkable. Yeah.
It's remarkable. And if they all gave at the same rate as Bill and Melinda Gates give, that alone would release $575 billion in additional capital, which is enough money to finance the Sustainable Development Goals in the 59 poorest countries twice over per year. Now, obviously, there's those that would argue, well, they made their wealth, they're entitled to spend it however they see fit. And, there's merit to that argument because, yes, they have discretion. I also believe no man is an island. So I think that we have to consider what sort of world do we want to create for future generations. But what I would say is that there are really practical ways in which philanthropists can do more. The first one is considering how much foundations themselves give. Do they just give the minimum legal tax threshold, which is about 5% per annum, while they're mostly earning about 7% in interest rates? So they're actually gaining the size of their foundations. The second way is to consider there's this new big tax structure here in the United States called donor advised funds, managed by groups like Fidelity and others. And they were initially set up to encourage newly minted billionaires, often from Silicon Valley, to try to get involved in philanthropy. What has happened is that these donor advised funds they got a tax abatement the moment you put money into these donor advised funds, but they didn't have a minimum amount you had to give away per annum. And unfortunately, every single year, 97% of them give away nothing. And so there's literally billions of dollars just sitting there that is already designated to go to charity, but it's not being put to good use. It's just making wealth managers wealthier.
Okay. It's just
earning interest.
Earning interest, I see.
Earning interest, let's call it 7 or 8% per annum, just sitting there compounding.
Okay.
And so even if we just focused on those donor advised funds, that alone is going to unlock tens of billions of dollars in capital that can be deployed, not just to support your alma mater or a college fund, but actually to do good in this planet.
Yeah.
And that's why the issues like climate change, like extreme poverty, there are finances available to invest in them right now. We just need to have the right policies in place to unlock them.
Totally.
If you find yourself inspired or angry, this podcast isn't just about talking. It's about making change happen, and you can do that right now. You can head to globalcitizen.org/crypower to take action on these issues. This is Hozier, and you're listening to my Cry Power podcast.
Global Citizen, just for context for people listening who may not have joined the platform.
So the way Global Citizen works is you register and you choose the issues that you care about. Let's say you care about the environment, or you care about gender equality, or you care about education for everyone on the planet. You can take action on those issues. And we have a team of experts at Global Citizen who are experts on all of those issue areas. And so they'll be designing actions that will have maximum effect. Because how are you supposed to know, whether you should be calling this world leader or that world leader?
Absolutely, yeah.
Fortunately, we have a team for that, and their job is to make sure that the actions on the Global Citizen platform have the most effect. So when you go on there and you sign this petition, or you send this tweet to this world leader, or you pick up the phone and you call this world leader's office, you will know that there's a team in the background who have been spending months and months and months thinking about why that particular world leader should step up at this moment. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, Stephen Colbert and Global Citizen launched this campaign called the Twitter Invasion of Norway.
Right.
And it was a bit of fun. And in one night, we sent hundreds of thousands of tweets to the Prime Minister of Norway. And Erna Solberg, who's her name, she called me up a few days later and said, come to Oslo. And we sat like you and I are sitting here now. And she said, will you please turn off the tweets? I'm in the middle of a local election and I can't see any tweets from the Norwegian people. I can only see tweets from global citizens. Please turn them off.
Yeah.
And I said, well, Madam Prime Minister, I wish I could, but I can't. You have to respond to them. Mm-hmm. And because it's a democratic platform. And she said, okay, I'll respond. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, she got up on stage and committed $250 million for girls' education.
Fantastic.
And that's the power of the movement.
Yeah.
You know, this is like democracy on steroids. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Often you think you can only vote once every 3 or 4 years, but Global Citizen is a platform where you can engage with these issues all year round.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the platform so powerful. The concert is really using the power of the immense power of music to unite humanity at key moments and provide that platform. But the platform itself is year round. You can take action all year round in support of issues that you care about.
Okay. I've one or two thoughts. I was going to just, I suppose I would ask you two questions. One, what is the most challenging part of it? Or, you know, either sitting down, or what's the greatest obstacle? And then I wouldn't mind asking you what's your favorite, or what's your most proud of, you know, what you're proudest of in the last few years. But first of all, yeah. So
what's the hardest?
What's the hardest part of that? What's the most challenging?
I think the hardest part is realizing that no matter how many global citizens there are, and the world is a small place, but it's still an incredibly diverse place, and geopolitics is still very complicated. You know, when I was in Mexico yesterday, you know, I was learning all about, you know, the mandate of the newly elected, relatively populist government in Mexico and their position on poverty alleviation and their strategy as opposed to the strategy of governments before them. And you have to, you know, be clear-eyed and analyze, you know, what role can citizens really play who feel so disenfranchised sometimes from that political process? What role can they really play in ensuring greater accountability and transparency to combat corruption, ensuring violence against women, which has been a huge issue in Mexico, is abated? And what role can they play in ensuring those that have been part of the urban drift into the major cities of Mexico can be part of the economic system? And so I think that every time we're in a new market, we have to ask those basic questions again. When we were in South Africa last year for Mandela's 100th anniversary, local activists said, you know, we are seeing young girls who are dropping out of school simply because they do not have access to menstrual hygiene products. And they had this campaign called It's Bloody Time. And they said, could Global Citizen use your platform to push for this? And so we did. We made it one of our number one actions. And sure enough, we got the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, on stage at the festival to announce a huge 169 million rand commitment to It's Bloody Time to provide menstrual hygiene products to thousands of schools across South Africa.
Fantastic.
And so every context is different. And I think, you know, when there's still 193 member states of the United Nations, that's a massive undertaking to kind of grapple with. How do we focus our energy, our time, and make sure that we're asking the right questions all the time? I think that's by far the hardest challenge. I think the corollary of that, the thing that I'm most proud of, is the fact that the platform is being used as an amplifying tool for amazing activists like those in South Africa. Like the fact that young activists around the world are reaching out to Global Citizen and saying, you know, I've been championing this issue. Like, let's say I've been championing issues like trying to end plastic pollution in the Philippines, but I didn't know how I could really convince our mayors to adopt a better recycling program. Or I'm desperate to see, sanitary napkins for kids in schools across South Africa. Or I'm campaigning to end child marriage, you know, in India. You know, these are really practical legislative challenges that advocates around the world care about day in and day out. And the fact that they can turn to Global Citizen and see that they're a platform of millions of citizens who will proudly stand alongside them and say, you know what, I love that you're championing that. I'm going to send that tweet with you. Yeah. I'm going to sign that petition with you, and I'm going to It was so cool last year in South Africa. Our global citizens made so many phone calls to the Department of Education and Department of Health in South Africa, they had to pull their phone lines out of the sockets because there were just too many phone calls coming in. And that's the power of a movement.
Yeah.
And that's what makes me excited.
Yeah, and there's global power there. Is it hard at times holding a world leader to account, or how to ensure that those goals are met, or that promises are kept? Is that a huge challenge?
So what we do is we take an approach, firstly, where we tell up front every world leader who makes an announcement on a global citizen stage that we're going to publish a report every 6 months tracking their progress. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, the auditing agency, worked with us to establish a framework, an auditing framework, to audit every single commitment the world leaders make. And that framework measures the following. It says, firstly, we have to make sure it's a new commitment, not just something they were going to announce anyway. Secondly, it has to be independently verifiable. So someone externally, not the government or not the commitment maker, has to be able to independently say, okay, I can see the impact and I can measure it. And thirdly, we ask this question called the but-for test, which is but for global citizens' actions would have the commitment already happened. And if it would have, then we don't count it. Or what we do, we call ourselves in that case a sector applauder, where we just applaud someone else's great work. But if global citizens did make the critical difference, as in but for their actions it wouldn't have happened, then we're proud to celebrate that. And that's what happens on stage. And then 6 months later, we issue the first report, and 6 months after that, we issue the second report. And we keep going years and years and years until the commitments are delivered. We have a full-time auditing team in our Johannesburg, London, and New York offices whose entire jobs it is to make sure those world leaders follow through on their commitments. And when they don't, we publish it. So on our board, we have extraordinary people like Randall Lane, the editor of Forbes. We have tons of journalists who actually will publish it in the public domain if the world leaders don't follow through on it. What's really amazing, to give you one example, a few years ago, the Danish government wanted to come on global citizen stage, and they were at the same time making a huge slash in foreign aid. And so we said, you can't come on global citizen stage. And we did it all privately because we didn't want to embarrass them. But then the foreign minister tweeted us and said, I'm disappointed that Global Citizen isn't letting me on the stage. And we're like, that's a silly move. And so we just replied publicly and said, well, the reason is this. And sure enough, the next day on the front page of the Danish newspaper was the politician at the time looked a bit silly. Yeah. Now, fortunately, since then, because of that, they've actually increased their foreign aid again.
Okay.
So it shows that public pressure does work.
Absolutely.
And so I think that we always try to take a very dignified approach. We don't want to embarrass anyone. Mm-hmm. We don't want to shame anyone. Mm-hmm. We want people to feel as though the aspiration of making the world a better place, of addressing these social ills, is something everyone should celebrate.
Yes. Yeah.
And our platform is just a tool to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's that's fascinating. It's really wonderful to hear. And also, these are people you want to work with in the future when they do want to sit.
The world is a small place. Someone who might be a junior minister today will be the prime minister tomorrow.
Totally. Tell me about it. And can I just one last question, and then just to leave it on something hopeful and exciting, something that you're looking forward to in the future, or something that you're super excited about now.
Well, the thing I'm most excited about now is I'm convinced that at key moments in history, humanity has come together to achieve extraordinary things. It happens super rarely. It happened back in 1985 with Live Aid, and it happened again in 2005 with Live Aid. And we've been working with the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Amina Mohammed, to see that 2020 could be our generation's moment. So we're planning the most ambitious campaign Global Citizen has ever embarked upon in support of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the campaign is called Global Goal Live. We're going to take the festival to 6 events all around the world in 5 continents. Our goal is to make it the largest cause broadcast event in history. But more importantly than that, our focus is on that $350 billion financing gap to achieve the global goals in the 59 poorest countries. Mm-hmm. And so we're focused on how can the private sector step up? How can government step up? How can philanthropists step up? How can the artist community unite and be creative unlike ever before? How can amazing collaborations happen? How can citizens take more actions than ever before all around the world? And so that's what I'm super excited about, because I do believe no matter how unhopeful this world can feel sometimes. The fact is that, yes, the progress towards eradication of extreme poverty has been slowing and in some parts of the world even reversing. And yes, while action on climate change has been growing, we know that over the last decade, carbon emissions have continued to rise. Despite all of that, the world does have a plan to eradicate extreme poverty and tackle climate change. We just need the political will to achieve it. So 2020 has to be our year. It's got to be our generation's moment, and I couldn't be more passionate about it.
Hugh Evans, I couldn't tell you how uplifting and fascinating, and just, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming in and
thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cry Power is made in association with Global Citizen, a movement of activists all over the world who are using their collective voice to end extreme poverty by 2030. You can head to globalcitizen.org/crypower to take action on any of the issues we talk about on the show and earn tickets to gigs all over the world by signing petitions, writing emails, or sending tweets to world leaders. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the Cry Power podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts right now. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Hozier, and this is Cry Power.